but we have to start with Jeffrey Epstein because the way you have written about him, it connects to a whole world of corruption.
Yeah.
Is he kind of the Rosetta Stone?
Yeah, I think it's sort of like a meta scandal. You're looking at someone who really had, I guess, for lack of a better metaphor, had his hands in a lot of pies, right?
Yeah, right.
So he was sort of at the center of a lot of scandals, but not necessarily at the top, right? I think he was more maybe middle management in a sense, but very central to a lot of these things going on, that sort of these networks in which he inhabits are involved in, numerous acts of corruption simultaneously.
Yeah.
And he, is there involved in many of them, but not necessarily at the top level, right?
So was he a spy?
I think he definitely had intelligence connections, and there's a lot, to suggest that was the case. I think one of the earliest hints we heard of that was having a Secretary of Labor, Alex Acosta, under Trump, say that one of the reasons he was pressured into giving Epstein a sweetheart deal during his first arrest in Florida was because he had been told by unspecified actors that Epstein belonged to intelligence. But that's kind of, what exactly does that mean? Was he an asset? Was he on the payroll? Which intelligence agency? Multiple intelligence agencies?
Right.
When you have his close association with someone like Ghislaine Maxwell in the mix, and her father had affiliations with numerous intelligence agencies, it really is an open question.
He was kind of a bad guy. Yeah. I'm reading your work about him, and explain who he was.
So Robert Maxwell was involved in many things, but he definitely played a major role in undermining U.S. national security by selling bug software to nuclear laboratories in the United States. And this was directly facilitated by well-known statesmen in U.S. history, like Henry Kissinger, for example. And a lot of the people, I think, that enabled him, at least on the U.S. side, tend to be those that favor global governance and, they kind of don't want the U.S. to have that kind of monopoly on power.
Because all of his family, they were killed in the Holocaust, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so he's in the West, England. He survives, becomes kind of William Randolph Hearst of England.
Yeah, media mogul, sure.
Yeah. And then betrays the West. And that's not because he was on the other, he wasn't on the Soviet side. He was on a global government side?
Well, I think you have to look at this network, and they've evolved over time, right? Robert Maxwell was very close to the Eastern Bloc. He had a very close relationship with intelligence figures in the KGB and also Bulgaria. He had a relationship with British intelligence and Israeli intelligence, and was involved in aspects of what later became known as Iran-Contra, which of course involves aspects of U.S. intelligence. So, I mean, he had his hands in, everywhere and everything. And I think ultimately people like him are interested in any deal they can make to advance their money and their power and their influence, they'll take it. So Robert Maxwell was very interested in having his family be like the Kennedy family, a political power dynasty. And that's part of why he started moving into New York City around, just a year or two before he ended up dying. And Ghislaine Maxwell was sent to New York sort of to be his emissary. Into the U.S., and he wanted her actually to marry a Kennedy, and this is attested to in past mainstream media reports. And you can see his efforts to get her close to, I think, one of the sons of Robert F. Kennedy, and also John F. Kennedy Jr., trying to get her sort of in that social tier, because he sort of saw that as, would advance his power and also, that of his children. And I think if you look a lot at the psychology of Robert Maxwell, he seems to have had narcissistic elements, and that could be because of the trauma of his past. And a lot of times narcissistic parents see their children as extensions of themselves. Yeah. And so, he's looking at how to build an empire and using his children to that effect. And you sort of see that with the psychology of Ghislaine Maxwell as well. So is Ghislaine,
was she part and parcel of from the beginning, or was she, kind of a good girl, idealistic, comes over here, knows that dad wants to put her into powerful positions, but not shopping women?
I think it's a lot more complicated than that. You have to look at her early history. The favorite son of Robert Maxwell was originally Michael Maxwell. He was in a vegetative state after a car crash, I think when he was 15. And that happened shortly after, just a few days after Ghislaine was born. So her family members and she herself have attested to that she was basically neglected for the first 3 years of her life and even developed childhood anorexia. Things like that. And then, not a few years after, she becomes the favorite child. So she goes from having this complete lack of parental attention to being sort of showered in it by Robert Maxwell. And that obviously is going to have a psychological impact on someone. And in addition, she was basically managed by her father from a very early age. He tried to manage her romantic life. He tried to manage what job she would have, and she was very dependent on him. So when he is dead in 1991, it makes sense that she would attach herself to someone with a lot of the similar characteristics, right?
So Dad didn't know about Jeffrey Epstein, wasn't alive at that point?
Well, the allegation have been made by people that worked with Robert Maxwell in the 80s that Jeffrey Epstein was seen in his offices frequently in the United Kingdom. And during that period of time, it was known that Epstein was active in the United Kingdom. He was allegedly being mentored by a British arms dealer named Douglas Leese with British intelligence connections.
God. First of all, you wrote 2 volumes on this.
1,000 pages.
Yeah, I mean, that is crazy amounts of work.
Yeah, my son was born in the middle of it, so it was really crazy.
You were there for that, I imagine, when your son was born. So tell me, 1,000 pages, and there's no fluff in it. I mean, it is.
It's dense.
It's very dense. Mm-hmm. Why is it nobody else is reporting on this?
Well, I guess I don't really know exactly why that would be, but the silence is very eerie about major aspects of the Epstein case. It ended up being 1,000 pages because as I was writing about Epstein, a lot of the connections that came up, I was just, increasingly aware that a lot of people in the American public, a lot of the names I was coming across, most people weren't going to be familiar with.
Correct.
Banks like the Bank of Credit and Commerce International or BCCI, the scandal that involved, or even things like Iran-Contra, people may have heard the name but don't really know what it involved. Mm-hmm. So I figured I was going to have to go back and sort of explain that to people. So that type of context is volume 1 of the book, and also the history of sexual blackmail and how it's been sort of an undercurrent in some past political scandals in American history, and how in these sorts of networks in which Epstein was inhabiting, that type of practice and exploitation even of minors for those purposes was actually disturbingly common. So Epstein starts to look less and less of he's not an anomaly, basically.
Right.
By the time you get through with volume 1. And so volume 2 is sort of my effort to, dig up as much as I could, with stuff that's publicly available, really, about Epstein, and also his greatest benefactor, Leslie Wexner, and then also, Ghislaine Maxwell.
Okay, so this is just...
There's a lot to discuss.
There's a lot to discuss here on just this, because this goes to the deep state, or you call it deep politics. And it's been going on for a long time, but people, I don't think, realize that, the Bourne Identity, those Jason Bourne movies, that is a reflection of some people's real lives. I mean, it's a totally fictitious story, but those things do go on. And I tell you, I have felt for a long time with the NSA, listening to everybody's phone calls. If you're important in Washington, they're going to do everything they can
to manage you. Yeah.
So if you're not rock solid in who you are and what right and wrong really is, they got you.
Yeah. But even they don't, today, I think we've moved away from the type of model that Epstein used for sexual blackmail. It's an era of electronic blackmail, and you don't even have to do anything wrong. They can just plant it on your devices and play gotcha that way. So it's really an unprecedented situation. And a lot of these intelligence agencies as I note in the book, really for decades have been totally out of control. And I really start off the book talking about how intelligence agencies and organized crime in the U.S. got in bed together, and really that symbiosis. It was originally justified out of wartime necessity during World War II.
Fighting the Nazis.
But it never stopped, right?
Right.
And it's, business is business, and some of these people in our own national security state, realized they could make a lot of money working with organized crime and really shielding them and getting in on the spoils, I guess you could say.